5 months ago, my son-in-law paid a doctor $9,000 in cash to sit across from me at a dinner table and declare on paper that I was losing my mind. 2 weeks after that, his lawyer filed paperwork asking a judge to take away my legal right to control my own money. He believed he was maneuvering to manage about $450,000 of a retired mechanic's savings. What he did not know, and still doesn't fully know as I'm telling you this, is that his paycheck for the last 7 years has come from a company I've owned since before he was old enough to drive. This is that story, start to finish, and I'm going to walk you through every step of it because by the end you'll understand exactly why I let it go as far as it did. Before I said a single word, my name is Thomas Whitfield. I'm 74 years old. I drive a 2001 Ford pickup with 214,000 miles on it, and a crack in the windshield shaped like a lightning bolt. I've never bothered fixing it. I live in a 3-bedroom house on Briarwood Lane in Springfield, Missouri. I bought it in 1987 for $81,000. Back when that number meant something different than it does now. The linoleum in the kitchen is original. It's curling a little at the corner, near the pantry. Every October, I climb up off the roof myself and clean the gutters, against my daughter's wishes, because a man who stops doing the things his body can still do has already started dying somewhere nobody can see it. My neighbor, Ron Delacroix, 31 years Air Force, thinks I spent my working life fixing transmissions at a shop on the edge of town, which is true. That's exactly how I spent my mornings for 11 years, starting in 1974. Hands black with grease by 9 a.m., proud of it every single day. What Ron doesn't know, what my church doesn't know, what the kid at the auto parts store, who once tried to upsell me on synthetic oil, didn't know when I told him regular was just fine, son, is that in 1986, I put up everything Eleanor and I had saved in 11 years of marriage and bought a failing regional trucking company for almost nothing because its owner was drowning in debt and desperate to sell. I spent the next 38 years quietly turning it into Ironclad Meridian Group, a logistics, warehousing, and light manufacturing company operating in 14 states with over 4,000 employees, worth today just under $2 billion. My name isn't on a single building. No magazine ever wrote a word about it. I built it that way on purpose, one quiet decision at a time, the same way you'd hide something valuable in the last place anyone would think to look, behind a bad porch light and an old truck nobody envies. I'm not telling you any of this because money makes a man interesting. It doesn't. Money's a tool, and a man who leads with it is usually compensating for something he lost a long time ago, or never had. I built what I built because I made Eleanor a promise in 1974, sitting on the tailgate of a borrowed truck outside that transmission shop, that our daughter would never once wonder if there'd be enough. That promise is the only reason any of what follows matters to me at all. I still remember the day I told Eleanor what I wanted to do with that shop, laying out the numbers on the back of an envelope at our kitchen table. She looked at those numbers a long while, then said I'd never once been afraid of hard work, and shouldn't for being afraid of it now, just because the number got bigger. We signed the loan papers 3 days later, at a bank that doesn't exist anymore, and I drove home that night, not knowing whether I'd just secured our family's future, or ended it. Let me tell you about my daughter, because nothing in this story makes sense without her. Claire Whitfield Doyle is 41. She's a pediatric oncology nurse at Cox Medical Center, the kind who remembers a discharged kid's favorite cartoon character 3 years later, the kind who's cried more times in that parking garage than she's ever admitted to me, and gone back inside every single time anyway. Her mother, my wife Eleanor, passed 9 years ago, 11 months from diagnosis to the end, and in the space that loss left behind, Claire became the person who calls me every Sunday at 6 o'clock without fail, not because she needs anything, but because that's simply who Eleanor raised her to be. I would tear Ironclad Meridian down brick by brick. every warehouse, every truck, before I let anything touch that woman's peace of mind. Hold on to that fact. It matters for everything that comes after. 5 years ago, at a friend's engagement party, Claire almost skipped because she'd worked a double shift. She met Marcus Doyle. Marcus is 43, 6'1", handsome in the specific way of men who've spent real money on their dentist and know it. He's a certified financial planner at a downtown firm called Castellan Private Wealth. The first time we met, Claire cooked dinner at her apartment, and I could tell walking in that she'd spent the whole day nervous about it, the table set a little too carefully. Marcus arrived in a blazer for a dinner that didn't call for one, shook my hand a half-second too firm, and within the first 20 minutes had told me about his firm's proprietary risk model, his golf handicap, and a fishing trip to a lodge in Montana that, and I quote, "You'd need a referral to even book." I said that sounded like quite a trip. He said it wasn't for everybody, in a tone that made very clear he didn't think I was the kind of everybody who'd get an invitation. I understood exactly what he meant. I just passed him the bread and let it go, and watched Claire's face the whole rest of that dinner, the careful, hopeful way she kept glancing between the two of us. I told her afterward, in the parking lot, that he seemed like a fine young man, ambitious. That was true. I left out the rest, because a father's first job is not to be right too early. It's to watch, and wait, and let his daughter's own judgment run its course before he ever puts a thumb on the scale. Here's the detail that matters more than anything else in this whole story. So stay with me, because once I tell you, everything that happens later is going to make a different kind of sense. Castellan Private Wealth, the firm Marcus works for, is a company I bought 9 years ago, quietly, when it was a small, struggling boutique advisory firm about to lose its license over a compliance mess, and folded into ironclad Meridian without a press release, without an announcement, just paperwork moved between attorneys who understand the value of silence. Marcus was hired there 2 years before he ever met my daughter. Through a completely standard process. Multiple interview rounds, background checks, reference calls, all of it. What he has never known, and doesn't know right now while I'm telling you this, is that I personally sign off on every senior hire at every company Ironclad owns, a habit left over from years when I couldn't afford to trust anyone I hadn't personally vetted, and I never broke it once I could afford otherwise. I read his resume myself. I approved his salary myself. When he shook my hand a half-second too firm the night we met, I already knew exactly what he made and exactly which mid-tier apartment my complex he'd lived in before the promotion he now brings up at every opportunity. If this story's got your attention already, do me a favor and hit subscribe. It costs nothing, and it genuinely helps a small channel like this keep making them. Let's keep going, because this only gets better from here. For the first 2 years of the marriage, Marcus was tolerable, the way a hotel lobby is tolerable. Pleasant enough to sit in, never actually warm. He'd nod through Sunday dinners at my house, check his phone under the table when he thought nobody noticed, and steer every conversation back to a deal he'd closed or a client he'd landed. I remember one Thanksgiving at Claire's, about 2 years into the marriage, when a colleague of Marcus's from Castellan stopped by for dessert. Marcus introduced everyone around the table, and when he got to me, he put a hand on my shoulder and said, "And this is Claire's dad, Tom. He was a mechanic for years, real hands-on guy." And before the colleague could even finish saying, "Oh, that's great. What kind of work?" Marcus was already 3 sentences into a story about a client account he'd just closed. I sat there with a slice of pie in front of me, entirely unremarked upon for the rest of the evening. I noticed. I always notice. I let it happen anyway because I've hired and fired enough people in 50 years to know a man's just real character doesn't show up when he wants something from you. It shows up the day he decides you have nothing left to offer. That day arrived for Marcus roughly a year and a half ago, right after I took a fall on my icy driveway one February morning and spent one night in the hospital for observation. A sprained wrist, a bruised hip, nothing more. The doctor told me I was, and I'm quoting him exactly, "Remarkably healthy for 73, Mr. Whitfield. Your blood work looks better than men 20 years younger." Marcus drove Claire to the hospital that night at 2 in the morning, and at the time I genuinely thought that was decency. Looking back now, Marcus sat in that waiting room and clearly for the first an opportunity dressed up as a family emergency. It started small. It always starts small. "Claire, has your dad seemed a little forgetful lately?" He asked about the Henderson account twice tonight. There is no Henderson account. There has never been a Henderson account. Marcus invented it whole cloth, on the spot, at my own dinner table, to plant something in soil he'd already been quietly preparing for months. Claire, working 60-hour weeks on a cancer ward, exhausted in the particular way that makes a person want to trust the people closest to her rather than interrogate them, brushed it off every single time because she talks to me every Sunday and knows exactly how sharp I am. But Marcus wasn't planting that seed for Claire's benefit in the moment. He was planting it for later, for a record that would one day need supporting testimony. Somewhere in the middle of that stretch, I ran a small private test of my own. Over dinner one Sunday, I mentioned casually that I'd been meaning to move some old savings bonds into a new account, but kept putting it off. "Probably $4,000 or $5,000 sitting there doing nothing," I said, watching Marcus's face while I said it. A man who wasn't paying attention to my finances at all would have nodded and moved on. Marcus didn't move on. He leaned in and offered, entirely unprompted, to take a look at that for me, no charge, professional courtesy, happy to help family. I thanked him and told him I'd think about it. And I never brought it up again, and neither did he, though I noticed, in the weeks that followed, that he asked Claire twice, offhandedly, whether I'd ever gotten around to moving those bonds. There were no bonds. I'd invented them on the spot, the same way he'd later invent the Henderson account to see exactly how much attention a man with nothing to gain would pay to a stranger's small, meaningless finances. Marcus paid a great deal of attention. That told me something, quietly, long before the rest of it started. Over the following months, the comments accumulated in small, deniable increments. He mentioned to Claire's brother-in-law at a barbecue that I'd gotten a little repetitive. He asked Claire, gently, whether I'd ever had my hearing checked, whether it might be worth just being proactive for peace of mind. He brought up, unprompted, a coworker's father who'd lost his savings to a phone scam, told with visible sympathy, and a subtext I didn't yet recognize as a subtext. One evening, at a dinner I wasn't even present for, he apparently told Claire's own mother, my late wife's sister, visiting from out of state, that he'd noticed some concerning things, and asked her, delicately, whether Eleanor's side of the family had any history of early cognitive decline. A question invented for the same reason as everything else, to build a paper trail of concern that would one day read, to a judge who'd never met me, like a consistent pattern observed by multiple family members over time, rather than one man's manufactured narrative repeated in different rooms. Each comment, alone, was small enough to dismiss. Together, over 18 months, they were a slow, deliberate campaign, and I only saw the whole shape of it once I sat alone with a compliance file and read his own words back to myself. The moment that changed everything for me happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, 5 months ago. I'd stopped by Castellan's downtown office for a routine compliance review I run twice a year at every company I own. Registered investment advisory firms are required to retain and monitor work communications. Every email, every call transcript, every search run on a company device. 7 years minimum, standard practice, nothing unusual about it. I sat down with the compliance officer to go through the quarterly flagged activity report. The same as always. One name on page 4 stopped me cold. Marcus Doyle, Flagged search terms: conservatorship attorney Missouri, cognitive evaluation elder financial capacity, affidavit diminished capacity checklist. I asked for the full file on that name. She had no idea whose son-in-law she'd just handed me. What came back over the next hour was 6 weeks of emails between Marcus and an elder law attorney, and transcripts of 3 calls placed from his work cell, the automated kind every regulated advisor's line generates for compliance review. Marcus had been at Castellan long enough to know better. But the number on his contract was a company line, issued the same week he made VP, and somewhere along the way he'd stopped thinking of it as anything but his own phone. Careful men get careless about the one thing they've never had to think about twice. In one call, dated 5 weeks earlier, Marcus told the attorney, easy, confident, he's 74, lives alone since my mother-in-law passed. There's some cognitive slippage, memory stuff, nothing dramatic, but it's there, documented informally at this point. Comments to family, that kind of thing. Look, between us, the guy's sitting on a paid-off house and maybe $450 in retirement accounts. Not life-changing money, but enough that if nobody's watching it, or somebody worse than us gets to him first, it evaporates fast. Then, a beat later in the same call, if we get a formal cognitive evaluation on record showing diminished capacity, we file the petition clean. I get named co-guardian for the financial side, and honestly, practically speaking, I'm the one managing it day to day since Claire's got zero bandwidth working 60-hour weeks. It's not about control. It's about not letting an old man who worked hard his whole life get taken advantage of by somebody worse than us. I read that transcript twice, sitting alone in a back office with a stack of routine paperwork I no longer cared about. $450,000. That was his private, confident estimate of everything I had built in 74 years on this earth. Not $2 billion. $450. He wasn't trying to steal a fortune. He didn't know one existed. He was trying to take what he genuinely believed was a modest, hard-earned retirement, using a manufactured diagnosis and my own daughter's exhausted love for me as the lever to pry it loose. I closed the file and asked the compliance officer to keep everything exactly where it was. I'd read everything I needed to for now. What I needed next was to watch exactly how far he'd actually go. Over the following weeks, I watched the campaign accelerate in small, almost invisible increments. Claire mentioned, carefully on one of our Sunday calls, that Marcus thought it might be smart for me to see a doctor just to get a baseline. I told her that sounded reasonable, and I meant it, because a genuinely worried family asking a genuinely healthy man to see a doctor isn't a crime. It's love, clumsy sometimes, but love. The crime, if there was going to be one, hadn't happened yet. I was watching for the exact moment it would. The invitation to talk things through as a family came about 3 weeks later, at Marcus and Claire's house at his specific request. Claire called that morning, and I could hear in her voice that something had been worked on, gently, patiently over months. Dad, Marcus just wants to check in tonight, maybe talk with a doctor together, just as a precaution. I could hear how carefully she'd been handed that word, precaution, like it wasn't quite hers yet. I love you so much, Dad. I just want to make sure you're taken care of. I know you do, sweetheart, I said, and I meant it. And that was the hardest part of all of this, knowing her fear was completely real while the thing feeding it was completely manufactured. I'll be there at 6. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen a long while. Then I made 2 calls of my own, the first to Harold Bishop, my attorney for the past 22 years, a man who's known Claire since she was in braces. I need you to run a full background file on a doctor named Raymond Alvarez, I said, and I need you to quietly find out everything you can about a conservatorship petition I believe is already being drafted against me. Harold, calm as always, said, "Give me a name and a timeline, and I'll have something for you inside 2 weeks." The second call was to a private investigations firm Ironclad's used exactly 4 times in its history. I gave them the same name, Dr. Raymond Alvarez. I wanted to know whether he had any connection to Marcus, and whether he had ever, in any capacity, actually examined me before, because I could say with total certainty I had never once set foot in that man's office. Then I laid out my clothes for Sunday. Work slacks, a clean flannel shirt, nothing else, nothing different from any other week of my life. I was dressing exactly the way I always dress, because I wanted to watch these people show me precisely who they were, when they believed nothing at all was at stake for them. If this story's holding your attention, hit like right now. It takes 1 second, and it genuinely tells the algorithm to put this in front of more people who'd enjoy it too. Let's keep moving, because Sunday is where things really start to turn. Sunday came in gray and quiet. I drove the truck to their place on Briarwood Lane. A nice colonial with hedges trimmed the aggressive way that tells arriving guests something about who lives there. Claire opened the door and hugged me, the way she has since she was 4 years old, holding on a half-second longer than usual. In that hug, I understood some part of her was afraid for me. She'd been quietly, lovingly convinced that fear was the responsible thing to feel about someone she adored. Marcus met me at the table with a warmth so calibrated it was almost impressive as a piece of craftsmanship. "Tom, glad you made it. Come sit, nothing formal here." A manila folder sat closed on the table, squared perfectly with the edge. Beside it sat a stranger, mid-50s, soft hands that had clearly never turned a wrench, a clinic lanyard around his neck. "Tom, this is Dr. Alvarez," Marcus said, gesturing warmly. "He's just going to ask you a few questions. Nothing invasive, totally routine. Lots of my clients' parents do this every year or two, just to be safe." Alvarez smiled the practiced, professional smile of a man being paid well to be somewhere he had no business being. "Mr. Whitfield, wonderful to finally meet you. I understand from the family there've been some memory concerns lately." I looked at Claire. Her hands were folded in her lap, fingers laced too tight. I looked at Marcus, confident the way a man is confident when he believes he's already won a game before the first move has even been played. "Happy to help," I said, sitting down unfolding a cloth napkin in a pattern Eleanor used to buy. "Go ahead, doctor. I've got nothing to hide." What followed was 40 minutes of theater, wearing a white coat, questions about the date, the day of the week, the sitting president. A list of 3 unrelated words, apple, table, penny, that I was asked to recall 5 minutes later after a conversation about something else entirely, counting backward from 100 by sevens, drawing a clock face showing a specific time. I answered every single question correctly, without hesitation, because there was nothing wrong with my memory beyond the ordinary wear of 74 years. I recalled all 3 words. I drew the clock hands in exactly the right position. I counted backward faster than Alvarez could write down my answers. And yet, at the end of it, he closed his notepad with a small, sympathetic sigh and said, with a gentleness I could tell had been rehearsed in front of a mirror, "Mr. Whitfield, based on today, I do have some concerns. Some subtle patterns here that, combined with what the families describe, I'd want to follow up on. In the meantime, I think it's wise for the family to consider some protective measures around your finances, just as a precaution." Before he closed that notepad, I asked him one question of my own, pleasantly, the way you'd ask about the weather. "Doctor, out of curiosity, how many of these evaluations do you typically perform in a week?" he said, without missing a beat. "Oh, quite a few. It's a big part of my practice these days." I nodded and said that was interesting, because I'd never once heard of him, in a town the size of Springfield, from any of the 3 physicians I see regularly, none of whom had ever mentioned a colleague doing this kind of work. He smiled again, a little thinner this time, and said referrals come through a lot of different channels. I let it go. I'd already gotten what I needed, which wasn't an answer, but a small crack in a story that had otherwise been delivered without a single hesitation all evening. Marcus slid the folder across the table, the motion smooth, practiced, the the motion of a man who slid this exact folder across this exact table in his imagination a dozen times before tonight. Tom, we drew this up with an elder law attorney, a good one, very respected. It's a financial guardianship. Nothing touching your house, your driving, any of that. I want to be really clear about that part. Claire and I would be named co-guardians, just to help manage things. Make sure nobody preys on you the way these scam artists target men your age constantly. We just need your signatures saying you understand and you're not contesting it. And honestly, I think given today, the court's going to see this as exactly the responsible thing a family should do. Claire's eyes found mine across the table, uncertain, searching, and underneath that uncertainty I saw something that hurt worse than any business betrayal in 50 years ever had. She'd been made to believe, one small comment at a time over 18 months, that protecting her father meant quietly taking away his voice. I opened the folder and read every page slowly, carefully, the way I've read every contract that's crossed my desk in 50 years of building something out of nothing. The scope of authority had grown since the version Marcus described on that call 5 weeks earlier. It now covered real property too, a detail he'd left out of his summary that evening. Marcus was named specifically as the one with day-to-day control. Claire was listed as largely oversight given, and I'm quoting the page directly, her demanding professional schedule. Then, on page 6, a date stopped me. A preliminary hearing already scheduled with the probate court, 3 weeks out. Penciled in like it was already decided, like my signature that night was just a formality standing between them and a judge. I closed the folder gently and set it back exactly where it had been. This is thorough. I appreciate the real thought that clearly went into it. I'll want my own attorney to look at it before I sign anything at all, given how serious this actually is. Marcus's smile flickered at the edges, just barely, the smile of a man who hadn't planned for the words, my own attorney, to be part of tonight's script. Of course, Tom. Take all the time you need. We're not trying to rush you into anything. We just love you and we're genuinely worried. That's the whole reason we're all sitting here. I finished my coffee, black, no sugar, the way my father drank it and his father before him. I hugged Claire goodbye at the door, a little longer than usual, and I shook Marcus's hand, firm, my eyes on his 1 full second, longer than the handshake strictly required. Whatever he read in that second, it wasn't the truth. Not yet. I said nothing for 16 days, 3 weeks, 21 days, and every one of them mattered, though nobody watching me mow my lawn or wave at Ron would have guessed it. Not a word. Not a visible ripple on the surface of my life. I mowed my lawn on Tuesday the way I always do. I had coffee with Ron on his porch and listened to him talk about his upcoming knee replacement. I drove the truck to church on Sunday and to the grocery store on Monday, bought the same brand of coffee I've bought for 30 years. On day 4, Claire called, tighter, quicker than usual. Dad, Marcus thinks maybe we shouldn't wait on the lawyer thing. He says if anything happened before it's official, the whole family could be exposed. I asked her what exactly Marcus thought might happen to me in the next 2 weeks that hadn't happened in the previous 74 years. She was quiet. Then, almost like she was asking herself as much as me, said, Dad, you seem completely fine to me. I don't know why I let myself get so worried. I told her that worrying about your father isn't something you ever need to apologize for, and that there was no reason on earth to rush a decision this serious. She laughed, a small, relieved sound, and said she'd tell Marcus there was no rush. On day 6, Marcus texted, Hey Tom, just checking in, hoping you had a chance to look over the paperwork with your attorney. I waited 4 hours, then typed, Still reviewing, son. These things take time, and I want to do this right. He sent back a thumbs-up emoji. I called Harold Bishop directly. Run the full file, I said quietly. Alvarez, every draft of that petition his attorneys produced, and Marcus's complete employment history at Castellan going back to his hire date. Then I went out into the yard and pulled weeds from around Eleanor's crooked maple tree until the sun went down, the way I do most evenings when I need my hands busy while my mind works something out. Here's what I already knew that Marcus didn't. 14 years earlier, back when Claire was still finishing nursing school, and I had no idea yet what kind of man she'd eventually marry, I had Harold set things up so that everything Claire would one day inherit already legally belonged to her, sealed off in a way no court fight brought against me, for any reason, could ever crack open, because it had left my ownership the exact day I signed the paperwork. I built that protection 14 years before I had any reason to think I'd ever need it, because that's simply what patient men do. The $450,000 Marcus believed he was carefully maneuvering to control was, in fact, just the visible tip of something he'd never once, in 18 months of planning, thought to look beneath. 16 days gone. 5 left before that hearing date. Harold's sat across from me at my kitchen tables with a folder considerably thicker than the one Marcus had brought to dinner, and walked me through it line by line. Alvarez had no record of ever treating me. His intake form for that evaluation was time-stamped by the clinic's own system 2 days before the dinner even happened. There was a personal check, $9,000, from Marcus's account, memoed, consulting fee, family matter. 4 drafts of the petition exist since that first version his attorney sent over, each one giving Marcus a little more. The final draft naming him for sole day-to-day authority, Claire listed mostly as a formality. One more fact offered flatly, no elaboration. Marcus was roughly $200,000 underwater on a real estate deal that had gone bad 2 years back. That was all Harold said about it, and all I needed. On a Thursday morning, 2 days before a judge I'd never met was scheduled to hear a petition about a man who didn't exist, I put on the Grace's suit I keep for closings, and drove the truck downtown to Castellan for the first time in almost a year. I walked into the top-floor conference room, the one with the good windows facing the river, the same room where I'd approved Marcus's hire, on paper, 4 years before he ever set foot in it. The 2 board members Harold had brought in, people who'd known me and my habits for over a decade, greeted me quietly, no fuss. Harold spread the file across the table in careful order, tab by tab, and checked his watch once. "He's got a 9:15 on his calendar," Harold said. "Should be along any minute." I sat at the head of the table, the investigation files squared neatly in front of me, and waited, patient as I've always been, for Marcus to arrive for what he believed, right up until the second he opened that door, was an ordinary Thursday client review. Before he walked in, let me just say this. If this story's got your heart going a little right now, drop a comment telling me where you think this is headed. I read every single one, and it genuinely helps this reach more people who need to hear it. He walked in with his coat still half-buttoned, a coffee in one hand, scanning the room the way a man scans, a room he thinks he fully understands, and then his eyes found me, sitting at the head of his own firm's conference table, in a suit he'd never once seen me wear. I watched the understanding move across his face in real time, floor by floor, like a building going dark one level at a time. Every piece of it arriving at once, on an ordinary Thursday morning, in a room he had believed, right up until that exact moment, belonged entirely to him. 10 seconds of silence, I let every one of them land. "Sit down, Marcus," I said. He sat the coffee cup shaking slightly before he set it down. "I'm not angry," I said. "Anger's for men who didn't see it coming. I heard you on the phone 5 months ago, calling my whole life's work $450,000 you were entitled to manage day to day." His face went the exact color of the folder in front of him. "Castellan belongs to Ironclad Meridian. I've owned Ironclad 38 years. 9 of them before you ever met my daughter at that engagement party. Your salary, your condo, that lodge in Montana you need a referral to book, all of it exists. Because I approved your hire personally, 4 years before you ever sat across from Claire at a coffee shop table." He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I turned the folder toward him, opened to the first page. Alvarez was paid $9,000 in cash to fake a diagnosis for a man he'd never examined. It's documented, time-stamped, verified. 4 drafts of a guardianship petition, each one handing you a little more control than the last. Also documented. I closed it. That's not a gray area, Marcus. That's fraud. Elder financial exploitation under Missouri law. Conspiracy. Our legal team is ready to file every one of those charges this afternoon, if that's what you'd prefer. Every trace of the confidence he'd walked in with drained out of him, visibly. He looked, for the first time in 5 years, very young and very far from any fishing lodge. But I'm not interested in destroying the father of grandchildren I might someday be lucky enough to meet, I said, after a long moment. I'm interested in clarity. So here's exactly what happens next. You resign from Castellan today, effective immediately. You withdraw the petition, notarized, filed by end of day tomorrow. Alvarez's license is the medical board's problem now, not yours to fix. And frankly, not entirely mine either at this point. What stays quiet between these walls is why you left this firm. What doesn't stay quiet, ever, under any circumstances, is you touching anything of my daughter's again, in any capacity for the rest of your life. Are we understood? He looked at Harold. He looked at the 2 board members. He looked back at me and I saw something in his face I hadn't expected. Not defiance. Shame, the real kind, the quiet kind, that only shows up on a man's face when he's finally seen himself with complete clarity and doesn't care for what's standing there looking back. I understand, he said, and the 2 words clearly cost him something. Good. I stood, buttoned my jacket, picked up the folder. At the door, I turned back once. One more thing. What Claire will inherit was legally hers 14 years before you ever met her, structured, so no guardianship, no court fight against me could ever reach it. You spent 18 months, and no small amount of money, building a case to seize the tip of an iceberg that was never actually attached to anything underneath it. Tell Claire I'll see her Sunday, 6 o'clock, same as always. We're not skipping a week over this. I drove home in the truck, the engine clearing its throat the way it has for 2 decades. Thinking about 38 years of being the man nobody looked at twice, and knowing the whole time exactly who he was underneath it. I went inside, put on a pot of coffee, and called my daughter. She showed up 40 minutes later, still in scrubs from a 12-hour shift. We sat at my kitchen table, and I told her all of it, slowly, from the beginning. She turned her coffee cup in a slow circle without drinking from it, silent for a long while. Then she asked the only question that actually mattered. Dad, all these years, why did you let me think we were just getting by? Because I wanted you to build your own life, Claire. Not one handed to you because of what I happen to own on paper somewhere, I said. I never wanted you looking at your father across a table and seeing a balance sheet instead of a person. I wanted you to see your dad, plain and simple. She cried, quietly at first, and then not quietly at all, and I held her hand across that worn table and let her. In the weeks after, life on Briarwood Lane went back to looking exactly the way it always had. Ron never learned more than family business, all handled. Claire's Sunday calls kept coming at 6 o'clock sharp, except now she shows up in person, more Sundays than not. And the first thing she does walking through my door is put on a pot of coffee before I can get to it myself, black, no sugar, like she's known how I take it her whole life. Which she has. I still drive the same truck, still climb up on the roof every October, still make coffee black, no sugar. Nothing about the way I live has changed, and that, I think, is exactly the point. The $2 billion was never the thing I was protecting. Claire was. The truck, the flannel shirt, the cracked windshield, all of it was just the shape I chose to protect her in, quietly, for 38 years, so that when the moment finally came, I'd already be standing exactly where I needed to be. Some men don't look powerful. They just are, and they've decided a long time ago that's nobody's business until the day it needs to be. The ones who mistake that quiet for weakness always find out eventually, usually at the worst possible moment for them. If this one got you, subscribe. We've got a new story like it every week, and I promise you, there are more where this one came from. I'll see you in the next one.